notice. We think we're going to have a really interesting informational presentation today. I do want to say at one point, though, that, and I do apologize for this, we're not going to be able to accommodate public discussion. So if you have questions, you could probably input them into the chat. And if we have the time, I will flag them to our moderator and see if we have enough time to respond to them. But I do apologize. This session will be webcast, which means that it and the presentations will be available on our webpage later. So you can share that with your colleagues and other interested parties. But at this point in time, pardon me, we won't call roll and establish a quorum, but our board president, Dr. Carol Mountain, will preside, and I'd like to hand that over to her at this point.
Thank you, Elaine. It's always fun to try to locate your unmute button, right? So I also want to welcome everybody and say that we're really excited to be able to have the three presenters that we have. And I'd like to just briefly introduce Dr. David C. Benton, who is the Chief Executive Officer for NCSBN. And he comes to us with a lot of impressive credentials and a long career in nursing and nursing administration. And I'm really excited to hear the things that he has to say, especially when he's speaking about next gen. And Dr. Philip Dickinson, who is also coming to us from NCSBN. He's the Chief Officer of Operations and Examinations, and I have heard him speak before. And he is a very engaging statistician, even though a lot of times we don't think of those two words as being in the same sentence, but he's very engaging. And we'd also like to welcome John Cordova.
This meeting is being recorded.
Who's coming to us from HWI, Health Workforce Initiative. John has also spoken at a variety of events, and he's considered an expert in simulation, and he's very pro-nursing and nursing education. So thank you, gentlemen, all for being willing to take time out of your day to come and meet with us and to share your wealth of information at this meeting. So at this time, I would like
This is the moderator. Actually, I do not see Mr. Benton logged in yet.
Yeah, Dr. Benton is working on it. Now, this is Elaine Yamaguchi again, so I actually kind of wanted to provide a little bit of a preface, if you will. As BVFPT has been working throughout the years, it's become really obvious, I think, to everyone in the community that we actually need to begin. Actually, we're probably a couple of years overdue. And I know conversations have been happening throughout the community and the professions for years, decades. But we decided that our executive officer and myself and our president and vice president and some others, we believe that it's important, it's critically important to start a bigger conversation of what nursing education should be looking like in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because while I believe these conversations have been happening before, the pandemic has really pushed everything into high gear, and it seems like a good assumption that the nursing education modalities and approaches that we've seen throughout the years are going to need to be updated, changed, shifted to accommodate new ways for distance learning, for a variety of different ways of teaching new nurses, and yet still producing that high quality patient care. So we just had decided to ask our friends from NCSBN and HWI to come and share some thoughts with us. And just as I said, a preface, we wanted to just kind of open that up. And I do see Dr. Benton on, and welcome, sir. At this point, why don't we go ahead? Vicki, do you have the slides?
Yes, ma'am, I do. I'll bring them up right now. And Mr. Benton has been promoted to a panelist.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
first PowerPoint is it's in the screen.
Dr. Benton, you missed our warm introduction of you, but you are clear to go whenever you're ready.
Mr. Benton, can you please give me a mic check? This is the moderator. It appears that Mr. Benton is having technical difficulties with his microphone.
We can't do anything with it.
Mr. Benton, this is the moderator. Your microphone is unmuted. Could you please give us a mic check?
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay.
I can hear it.
So, okay, so thank you. Can you move the slide? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm terribly sorry. I did actually hear the introduction, and I apologize for the technology problems. Which on this side was it was unmuted, but you didn't seem to hear me. So let me start. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you some of the work that we're doing in terms of regulatory reform. This is work that commenced ahead of the COVID-19 crisis, but obviously with that crisis, we've had to accelerate issues. So let me move to this first slide and just remind you of something that Albert Einstein said. He said that the future is an unknown, but a somewhat predictable unknown. To look to the future, we must first look back upon the past. That is where the seeds of the future were planted. And I just somewhat chuckle to myself. And back in 2019 at the Delegate Assembly, I said that one of the things that we had to was an increasing number of crises. And I actually made reference to the fact that we were potentially due a major pandemic. I didn't actually think that those ideas that I seeded in 2019 would have actually sprouted this year. So be careful what you ask for. Next slide, please. Thinking about what Einstein told us, it's not that we are alone. It is that there are other regulators, both in the United States and around the world, that we could look to. And one of the things that I just want to reflect upon is the fact that New Zealand was the first country in the world to introduce nurse regulation. Back in 1901, they passed the Nurse Registration Act. It was mercifully short. It was only 3 pages long, 21 clauses, in less than 1,500 words. And I long for the days that nursing legislation was as short and succinct. But in that act, all the major issues that you would expect to see were in fact covered. And I think there's a message in there for us in terms of actually how we learn from others, sharing good ideas and see what we can implement locally. That doesn't mean to say that we simply transplant things, but we actually look upon it very carefully and see how it would apply within our particular context. Next slide, please. So back in 2016, I asked the board of directors if they would be prepared to support an effort to try and learn from regulators, both across the United States and in Canada, but from around the world. And we convened a group of 80 individuals, mostly nurse regulators, but we also had physical therapists, we had doctors in there, we even had a senator, we had representatives from the Federal Trade Commission and for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and indeed from the World Health Organization as well. And we focused on a discussion about what we could learn from regulation worldwide and identify the trends that were appearing there, and then looking to those trends to see where it might take us into the future. And that piece of work was written up and it was published as a supplement. It's freely available on our website, called Regulation 2030, First Steps of a Journey. Next slide, please. In doing that work, we identified 25 major trends that had evolved over time. It's not to say that these have progressed in a kind of linear fashion, as some of the new organizations that just came into regulation have kind of been able to jumpstart their work. But those ideas, those 25 trends, really fell into 7 major areas. And you can see these on the slide. Governance, purposes and processes associated with regulation, the licensees or registrants, workforce, education, fitness for practice, and technology and information. And because of your interest, I'm going to focus particularly on education, but I'm also going to touch on the others as we go through this as well. Next slide, please. So this I would encourage you to look at in the publication, but just to give you a feel for how the publication is structured, each of these 7 areas have a number of sub-themes. So for example, in the case of governance, you have the nature of the regulator itself. You've got the characteristics of the board. You've got the members of the regulatory board themselves, and you've got the accountability of that board. And over time, the way that we have viewed this has changed. So initially, regulators were often triggered by the professional associations, and quite often they were more akin to guilds, where their focus was really about promoting the profession rather than protecting the public. But then, over time, they became autonomous bodies, often with either on their own or as part of ministerial departments or part of state government. They then became part often of umbrella agencies. And even nowadays, what we're now starting to see is performance managed entities where the regulators are now being held to account with independent oversight, looking at the work that they are doing and meeting the needs. So each of these trends, we tracked what the leading edge thinking was on this. And we then asked the group of 80 to sort of say, well, if this is the leading trend, where is it going to take us in the future? Next slide, please. Nope. So in relation to education in particular, one of the major areas that we've looked at is the whole idea of setting standards. Often, initially, these were based on education and training. And then we started to see formal standards being set in terms of content, in focusing on different elements of knowledge and being aligned with the requirements of a code of conduct. Increasingly, we've seen a model that's based on competence and competencies and tasks that need to be performed. And increasingly, what we're now starting to see, and Phil Dickinson will talk about this later, in relation to high-level competencies relating to judgment and decision-making. As healthcare has improved, the judgments that we ask clinicians to perform, both at the licensed practical nurse level and the registered nurse level, and indeed at advanced practice level, has continued to increase and become increasingly more complex. So we need to think about what that means for the way that we approve and set our standards. From that, obviously, curriculum content, looking at how this has evolved over time, and how do we accredit these programs in a way that actually minimizes bureaucracy, but maximizes the information that you need to make sound judgments in terms of whether programs are fit for purpose. We've also moved away from a learning model that was basically based on once you've done your education, that's it done. You then practice for the next 40 years and we forget about it, to one where there's a recognition of continuing competence and the need to maintain your education throughout the years as the health system evolves and changes. And indeed, the pedagogy itself has evolved from one which was focused around the teacher to one that's focused around the learner. And that's a very different model. And again, in terms of how we regulate that model, we've got to think about different approaches. I will not go into all of these in detail. The report is available for you. Next slide, please. So when we analysed those 25 trends and we asked people to project into the future where those trends might take us, we then identified that to be most successful in the reform of regulation, there were 4 component parts that we needed to, as regulators, really think very seriously about. And as a board of directors of the regulatory body, you also need to think about what that means for the way that you exercise your duty of care and your requirements of your mandate. In the past, the regulator was often seen as a soloist. They were the group that was protecting the public, but they were the only group that was protecting the public. That's what happened 100 years ago. That's no longer the case. As regulators, we are part of an orchestra where there are different players that contribute to that process. So the way that we regulate needs to be based on a model of collaboration. How do we as the regulator play our full part, and how do we complement activity that's going on within the healthcare setting, the education setting, wider society as a whole? To do that effectively as regulators, we need to have a set of performance measures and metrics, not at a granular level, but at a high level. So as a board of directors, you should be looking at a set of metrics that actually tell you how well, as a regulator, you are performing. And that is something that can be used to hold your performance to account as well. The governance of the organisation is critically important, particularly as we start to change. And therefore, these issues of involving lay members as part of the board to bring different perspectives, added value to the work that we do is very, very important. And the use of data and technology is a critical step. We increasingly are living in a technologically driven world, and that information could be critically important in providing new information in a way that we never had 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, which will enable us to be much more proactive rather than reactive. Next slide, please. So to summarize this process, we analyzed the global literature on regulation, not just the nursing, not just nursing regulation, but all professional regulation. We identified 25 regulatory trends. By pushing those to the limit to see where they might take us, we identified these 4 focusing concepts, which a regulator needs to think about in terms of how they do their business if they're going to move forward. They need to collaborate, they need to have performance measures, they need to think about their governance, and they need to use data and technology to the full. They need to set themselves challenging yet achievable strategic objectives. And that will result in a regulatory model that is fit for a complex digital age, where we are no longer born, educated, work, and die in a single physical location, but one where we will move around the country. We will undoubtedly use technology, perhaps delivering services across state lines. and therefore the regulatory model has to reflect that new reality. To do that effectively as regulators, we actually need to get much better in communicating with our stakeholders, both our licensees, but also the educational community and the employer community. We need to be better at change management and performance management and quality improvement. And we need to interact with policymakers in a way that creates a legislative framework that is agile and enables us to shift with these changes quickly as new challenges emerge. We need to form strategic partnerships, and we also need to be far better at data analytics and economics. Now, California is blessed by the fact that you have a large population, but even in a large population, the capacity of one single organization to do some of the data analytics and some of the economics analysis that will be needed to really decide what is effective and what is efficient is limited. And I would recommend that in terms of regulatory reform, this is where regulatory bodies, professional regulatory bodies, should be looking to collaborate with each other to actually develop systems that will enable you to compare and contrast and short circuit some of the learning, taking ideas from sister organizations that will be helpful for all. Next slide, please. So, having completed the work in terms of giving us some direction, we started to see a number of discussions taking place within the policy environment about what does it mean in today's world as a regulator to truly act in the public interest. There's been a lot of criticism about regulators potentially acting as barriers, and policymakers have often actually grouped regulators together. We're all the same. Well, we're not. We're very, very different. Some regulators truly have to protect the public in a way in terms of the risk that that individual licensee can give to the public in a way that perhaps other regulators do not have to worry about. So being able to clearly articulate what it means as a nurse regulator to act in the public interest is very important. So as a group of executive officers from across the country, 2 years ago now, we explored this issue and the criticism that was being levied by some of the libertarian groups in relation to licensure, where they believed and the economists believed that the market should just simply run public protection. We took those comments, and the executive officers, and Elaine was one of them, to look at these comments in a very analytical way, and, if you will, to produce short 30-second elevator speeches that people could give in response to some of these comments. We took that information, we then looked at the evidence around that, and we documented that. So in this report, Acting in the Public Interest, there is a full analysis of those comments that the different groups often levy, but also there is a whole series of short elevator speeches that actually help you respond when of criticism. Next slide, please. Now, acting in the public interest is not something that is fixed. Just as we identified that there is a series of trends that have taken place over the years, what we're also seeing is that there is an increasing narrative that as regulators, not only do we need to protect the public, but we also need to be efficient and effective in the way that we do that, and that we minimize the regulatory burden so that we just use the amount of regulation that is needed to truly protect the public and not to place a burden on the way that services can be delivered. That's a very different way of thinking, and a way that requires us to really engage with our stakeholders in a way that perhaps we haven't done so much in the past, although this has been changing over the last 5 to 10 years, I would suggest. Next slide, please. Next, yeah. So in the report, there is a whole series of responses under these major headings. Comments about standards of education, comments about standards of practice, standards of conduct. An increasingly large problem that regulators are now facing is the prevention of fraudulent practitioners entering practice. The technology is there, and we are being inundated with people that are using false credentials, etc. And the technology that we need to use to detect that has to be equally as efficient. Also, in terms of licensure and the way that we license, using again technology to help us, and to look at continuing competence rather than continuing professional development. It's not simply enough to attend a lecture and gather a number of hours. It's actually about how do we demonstrate ongoing competence to make sure that we're really fit for today's practice. Thinking about removing practitioners for substandard care, we have a model across the world at the moment that's really based on when things go wrong, people are drawn to our attention. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to intervene at a much earlier stage? And NCSBN at the moment is working with colleagues in Spain to look at how we could partner, the regulator could partner with the employer to use the electronic health record to identify suboptimal practice and to intervene with that in a framework that prevents people coming forward and being referred to the regulator. So instead of actually looking for bad apples, we're now looking to shift the entire curve of performance towards excellence. So really moving our thinking in that direction rather than one where we just simply deal with problems. Another piece of work that we're doing is with colleagues in Australia and colleagues in the United Kingdom. And the Texas Board of Nursing at the moment is working with this research project to look at how we can use machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify high-risk complaints and to speed the process. Because a delay in dealing with a complaint is not in the interests of the licensee, and it's certainly not in the interests of the complainant. And if we can actually deal with that efficiently and effectively, we will actually reduce the costs that are the burden on many of the regulatory bodies at the moment. Next slide, please. So I did say that we can learn from our colleagues from around the world. And the third document that I want to draw your attention to is this most recent publication, A Global Profile of Nursing Regulation, Education and Practice. NCSBN, for its 40th anniversary, reached out to regulators across all jurisdictions in the world, and we gathered information on their education, on their practice, on their research activities, on their governance, and we have put that into a global regulatory atlas where you can pull up your information and you can compare it with information on how regulators in other jurisdictions address the same issue. That can be incredibly helpful if you're reviewing and revising your processes, because you can see what other people are doing as part of that. There is a short video, it's about 1.5 minutes long, that you can watch on the website, which explains a little bit more about this. But the report has a lot of very valuable information in there in terms of some of the leading edge thinking that's going on in relation to education, to setting standards, to discipline, to the various component parts that are our core business. Next slide, please. So if all of that isn't enough, of course, we've had COVID-19 come along. And I just want to remind us that we are the first generation on this planet since the end of the Spanish flu that are facing something that will it's reshaping economies, it's reshaping education, it's reshaping healthcare delivery, and therefore the things that are happening to us here and now, we need to learn from that, because when you look at previous events such as H1N1, there's a lot of information there about how laboratories need to work and how we need to learn about PPE and various other things. But what is not in there is about how regulators need to change. So one of the things that I was very keen to do when this came along was to establish weekly calls with all of the executive officers and really get them to tell me what problems they were facing and to see how we could help address those problems and capture that information for all of us to learn in real time. Next slide, please. Darwin told us that it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change. So at this moment in time, we actually need to be really hyper responsive. We need to learn from each other in a way that we've never done before. So whilst we are now holding those calls every 2 weeks, there is still lessons to be learned, and governors are continuing, particularly as we've seen this resurgence, to issue new guidance, new executive orders, and we need to be agile enough to be able to respond to that. So as regulators, we could play our full part. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've done is that this year in April, the World Health Organization produced a document called the State of the World Nursing Report. And I was privileged to serve on that global group to help draft this report. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to really test whether or not the major recommendations had relevance for the COVID-19 crisis. So as part of the launch event, I did a short 6-minute video, which actually took the recommendations and highlighted how we as regulators have responded to this. And again, that video is available on our website. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. Next slide, please. What we learned from the discussions with executive officers was that there were a number of legislative responses that our governors were issuing. And we were able to distill those. But those legislative responses needed an operational response. And sometimes governors hadn't thought through the implementation of those legislative elements. And that has caused problems for regulators and our ability to protect the public. We have to learn from that, and we have to actually present that information in a coherent way to our policymakers to make sure that we don't make the same mistake twice, that we continue to protect the public and provide access to services simultaneously. We've got to be able to walk, talk, and chew gum all at the same time. Doing one is not enough. So we have to learn lessons, and we have to make recommendations to our legislators. Next slide, please. This is a very complex area. There's a lot of learning, and this is really in a single slide what it's all about. But there is a full report on this that was published in one of the journals recently. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we identified was that in this process, we needed to think about how do we reduce cost, how do we increase access, and how do we assure quality simultaneously. That, of course, is RIA, and for those of us that have been in regulation for a while, know that regulatory impact assessment is something that should, and indeed increasingly must, be done when we either establish a new regulatory body or we go through the legislative process as part of that. So part of what we need to do in this is always ask the question, can we do this in a more cost-effective way? Can we increase access to the service and assure quality at the same time? Are there partners that we can work with? Next slide, please. In the work that we did with the executive officers, there's a number of really tremendous examples that we identified. Working to full scope of practice, and the fact that we've been able to push the limits on that, really enabling people to work to the full education in a safe way. And what we're starting to see both at the LPN, the RN, and the APRN level is really an interest in seeing how we can do that. As we have fewer children and more people in retirement with complex healthcare needs, we're really going to have to think carefully about who does what and how they do it to their maximum ability. We do need a digitally coordinated licensure system so that if people are delivering services across state lines, they can do that in a very safe way. And that if something does go wrong, we saw this happening where New York asked for a whole series of volunteers and New Jersey asked for volunteers at the start of the crisis, and people genuinely volunteered. But amongst those volunteers, there were individuals who went to do harm. Some of them were caught. And because those individuals did not have a license in that state, the licensing body could not investigate. And of course, because those people came from another state, their authority to investigate stopped at state lines. So some of these issues, we need to think about the connectivity of technology. Now, the nurses system facilitates that, but the ability to investigate and do something about it often is blocked by our existing legislation. Advanced practice nurses really stepped up to the plate. A number of barriers were removed, and I hope that these barriers will remain absent as we return to a new normal. And the work that we were able to do, both in terms of the next generation NCLEX exam, and indeed being able to maintain exams, and Phil and his team did a fabulous job in getting our partner Pearson VUE to prioritize us as an essential service, and to work with individual governors to open up capacity in a way that was safe for the individuals, but also maintained that essential pipeline of nurses into service. Next slide, please. So I just want to finish off by saying that we have documented all of this learning. It's there for you to use. And I'm delighted to answer any questions that you may have on this. I realize that as regulatory boards, there is a huge responsibility placed upon you to protect the public. The more diverse the board is, the better the ideas will ultimately be, but so will the steepness of the learning curve, because people come with a different background. Not everyone is a nurse, not everyone is a lawyer, not everyone is a technology expert, but together we produce far stronger solutions that will really protect the public and advance access to healthcare in a way that will be able to deal with both today's and tomorrow's challenges. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this. I don't know if you want me to take questions now or whether if you want to move on to the next presentation on the next generation NCLEX that Phil will deliver.
Actually, thank you so much for speaking. That was awesome. I would like to open it up and see if there are questions, at least for a few minutes. Board members, moderator, you'll help with this, right?
Yes, I will.
Thank you so much. Are there questions? Okay, well, you can think about it. You may decide you have some questions at the end of the next presentation by Dr. Dickinson.
There is a comment in the chat, which I don't know if it's been there for a while or not, which says variance in hours. For NCSBN, do you recommend for clinical hours and theory hours necessary for a licensed vocational nurse? Talking with many other states, I've noticed that there is a large variance in these hours from state to state. California has the most clinical hours of all of them. So this is one of the areas where there is variance both nationally across the country, and there is also variance internationally as well. And in terms of this, you cannot look at this in isolation. You've also got to look at it in relation to the scope of practice. So one of the questions that you need to look at is, if you're going to move to any kind of standardized number, you need to look at moving to standardized scopes of practice as well. And whilst in relation to the RN, there is probably less variation in the scopes of practice. In relation to the VN, there is actually more variation across the states. And certainly some of the work that Phil and his team have been doing in Canada has illustrated that the scope of practice for the VN in Canada is a little bit more comprehensive than we have in the US. So it's a great question. It's something that, you know, just having a single magic number would be wonderful. The problem you've got to ask is, do we all learn at the same rate? And do we all learn in the same way? And is there a better way of assessing competence rather than just simply counting hours?
Answer. Dr. Benton, can you also address, I know that in California, our standard for LVN pass rate is 75%. We want all of our students, 75% of our students, to hit that benchmark. Is that similar across the country and around the world? I mean, is that a standard for everybody, or is it a higher standard of 80% or 85% of all graduating students to hit that mark?
So we're actually, there's two different issues in here. One is the standard that needs to be passed to pass the exam, which is standard across the nation. And I think what you're referring to is the number of people that are passing out of a particular program before you start to examine the functionality of that program. Now, Phil will probably talk about this as well, but the NCLEX exam, whether it be the PN exam or the RN exam, is not designed to test individual programs. It's designed to test the individual student. And therefore, that 75% of a cohort passing is only an indicator. And Nancy Spector and a group of colleagues from different states have been looking at a suite of measures that you would want to look at to assess the functioning of the particular programs. And again, that has been produced as a supplement to the journal and is available again for download. So instead of just looking at 75%, you look at issues around the leadership of the program. You look at various other dimensions as well. This was distilled from the literature. It was distilled from a Delphi study, and it was also distilled from your program reports as well. So what are the things that tell you that something's just not quite right here with this particular program?
And is that paper available on the NCSBN website?
It is. It's a supplement to the journal. So if you go to the journal website, if you go through the passport system and you go to the journal website, it's freely available. It's a free download, so you can get it off the main Elsevier journal website as well. But the entire report is available there. and Alicia can certainly send you a PDF of it. It's probably the easiest way. I'll get Alicia to send that to Elaine, and then you can obviously share it with the rest of the board members.
Thank you so much. That would be awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
This is Cheryl Turner. I have a question. May I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes. So with respect to the area in education, do you or your organization have any recommendations regarding the ability or lack of ability of the students to have access to live patients because of the pandemic? It seems like it is affecting, their ability to get the proper training and to graduate with the proper requirements because of a lack of that.
So again, and this was something that I have to give credit to the executive officers for. Early on in the pandemic, when this started, we started to hear about education service providers closing off their clinical spaces, and that was partly because of often limits of PPE, etc., as part of that process, and concerns about people coming in and potentially transmitting the disease or receiving the disease as well. So we convened a group which involved colleagues from the National League for Nursing, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, AONL, and a number of other groups as well. And we came up with some examples of where the regulator had worked particularly well with education and service providers to create a education service partnership. And we've subsequently done a webinar on this, and there's a number of videos that are available as well in relation to that. I am actually having a teleconference later this week with Robin Begley, who is the executive officer from AONL, because I want to have a discussion with her, because with the increasing numbers that we're seeing across the country, I suspect this will become a bigger problem rather than a smaller problem. We are in a position now where previously hospitals switched off elective procedures. That's not happening with this increase, and therefore the need for nurses is going to be even greater. And of course, we're moving into winter, and a lot of nurses are actually quite tired. So turning off the tap in terms of enabling people to meet the requirements isn't a particularly wise move. And I think the best solution for this is actually about building strong relationships and trust between education providers, service providers, because if they don't get access to clinical, they're not going to be safe coming into the environment without that. Now, you can increase the amount of simulation. We know that you can do that effectively, but you can't just turn it off completely. So a balance has to be struck, and we need to be creative about how we facilitate access to much needed clinical placements.
It does look like there's another question in the chat box about measuring the percent of passing the state board.
When it comes to measuring percent of it tracks on the watershed to include only graduates in the last 2 years. Currently, we have graduates. So what we look at is first-time passing rates. We don't look at the figures in relation to individuals. I need to know exactly what it is that your practice is in relation to that. But we look at first-time passing is what we look at.
Hi, this is Yoli Yamaguchi. Actually, let me take a stab at that question from Karita. To change this policy, actually to create a policy, we would need to pursue statutory authority. In other words, pass a bill. This is something that I know has come up at the directors forums a few times, and it's really an interesting concept. So I think this is something we're going to want to discuss kind of among the whole community of how best to structure a policy. So I appreciate the question, and it's, believe me, it's something that we've been talking about.
Thank you, Elaine. I mean, these decisions are obviously jurisdiction specific because they are often bound into legislation.
Are there other questions? Are there other questions before we move forward for Dr. Benton? Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak with us and to share these concepts. I know I really sincerely appreciate it, and I'm sure the other board members do as well.
Thank you very much.
Is Dr. Dickinson, is he on?
I believe so, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Dickinson, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's an honor, pleasure to be here. Well, I can't see you, but I'm sure you're all looking good, so that's great. I'm going to give you a little brief walkthrough of where we're at right now with what we're calling the next generation NCLEX. And keep in mind that this affects both RNs and PNs, LVNs. So this is all encompassing. I want to talk about the research and clinical judgment measurement model and how we got there. I don't know how many of you have heard this already, so I'll do a brief background for some of you. This started with some research as early as 2012, but one of the things that sort of was the tipping scale for us is that in a large-scale lit review, a couple things were clearly prevalent throughout it, and that is that the increasing client age, David mentioned that as well, adding to the increasing client acuity, changes in healthcare where we're seeing more RNs, LVNs, even at an entry level, having increased demand on them making very competent clinical judgment. That we took a look at it says if that's the case, and our job is to ensure that we're providing the best measurement back to any board of nursing who is issuing a right to work, that we needed to take a look at, are we doing that well? Does our current models work in measuring that? And so if you go to the next slide, I want to give you a couple other data points that continue to push us in that direction. The other literature review finding, which was concerning, is that 50% of novice nurses, meaning those new nurses within the first 12 to 18 months, were involved in some sort of nursing error. Now, admittedly, this doesn't tell you to what degree, but 50% were somehow documented involving the nursing errors. What became more concerning is of that 50%, 65% of those of those errors were attributed to. I put the last signature out, or last data point out here for an important reason. One is it was in the literature. Two, I'm not going to suggest that there isn't some bias here, because if I ask the educators and do their literature, that number sort of flips and about 80% are satisfied. But what is important here is the employers that are receiving these entry-level nurses are not particularly satisfied with their level of clinical decision-making. But all in all, the picture that gets painted out of all this is there's little doubt that clinical judgment, the ability to make decisions related to client care, the ability to make decisions related to public health and safety is an important issue. Next slide. And so one of the things that how we got there, that was 2017, but how did I even get there? I talk about this many times when I'm speaking to different groups, is as an operating officer, not a psychometrician, I happen to be that too, but as an operating officer, I think it's always important for any organization to every 3 to 5 years, simply ask this question: are we doing the right thing? And so what I did was, having put that out there, the NEC turned that on me and said, so is the NCLEX measuring the right thing in 2012? And you know what? My answer was, I don't know. And their command to me was, then you need to find out. And so we set out to find out, are we really measuring the right things? And we did this through 2 studies as well as the LIT review. But in 2012, we started asking that question, started looking around, looking at our items. Then we went into a strategic practice analysis. So we did a functional task analysis in 2012 and a strategic analysis in 2015. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk briefly about them. So in 2012, we did a functional job analysis, and what I wanted to do was try a different approach. So you may know that we do a practice analysis every 3 years, and that practice analysis sort of follows what has been for ages defined as best practice. Now, best practice in practice analysis is that you bring together a group of experts who have worked with entry-level nurses, and you ask them what are the critical tasks they do. And you go through quite a process, but ultimately that ends in a survey that you then send out to entry-level nurses. And those entry-level nurses, by our default, are generally defined as they have been working in practice for 12 months or less. But the way we ask that question in the past has been, based on your last shift of 8 hours. And so we say, can you remember, I don't know when your last shift was, but can you remember that, at least giving those last 8 hours, how you did these 150 tasks and how important they were, how frequently you did those? And I said, you know what, that's great, but that's asking somebody to do a memory check. What if we changed that? And so in 2012, what I said was, I actually want to change how we're going to do that. And instead of starting with the experts, let's start with observers. And so we hired about 12 to 15 IO psychologists. They're industrial organizational psychologists. They're observers who do practice analysis sort of things, define tasks. And we sent them across the United States. We have 4 geographic regions in the United States that the council uses. We sent them to all 4 regions into 24 practice settings, ranging from major medical centers, urban hospitals, physicians' offices, long-term care facilities. So we tried to cover the large practice settings, and we sent them, we covered the 50 states and the U.S. territories. We had a tenure range of people we watched from 0 to 45 years. Of tenure, not age. And there were about 2,522 SME experts involved in this. And what we did was we sent them out, and for 3 days straight, around the clock, they observed the work of the nurses. And they documented, longhand, documented everything. And at the end of those 3 days, those reports were sent back to us. We gathered about 2,500 pages of written observations, ranging from, quite frankly, they went to the bathroom to what they really did. I mean, it was very comprehensive, but it wasn't, did we have to remember we had it all? The problem, by the way, of this that I didn't calculate was 2,500 pages of written information that you now have to get something to help you put that so you can actually make some sense of it. I'll show you how that worked, but ultimately we repeated that in 2015 with a much smaller group, sort of as a confirmatory analysis 3 years later. You can see states 10-year range was number pretty consistent. And it didn't matter. Both came back with 3 top areas identified as critical to the work of the nurse, both RN and PN. And that was clinical judgment, professional communication, and active listening. They all tended to rise to the top. Next slide. And I wanted to show you how we analyzed this because 2,500 pieces of data was difficult. And so this circle represents only one major, I want to say, major task. So for instance, this might represent client admission. All right. And so we what are the tasks of client admissions? You can see they're listed as tasks. And what are the skills the nurses need to complete those tasks? And then we said, let's build an algorithm that links the task to the skill. And we had some subject experts come in and help us with this. But ultimately, we built an algorithm, started running these observations through it. And what we found out, so for instance, in just client admission, that you can see skill 33, which was clinical judgment, was directly related to almost every task in client admission that a nurse had to complete. There were only about 6 here that weren't. And why do I show you this one? Because it's indicative of what we saw in almost every other task. Almost every task that we had on a practice analysis in the past, over 65% of every one of those tasks required some element of clinical judgment. And so, next slide. What that meant to us is this is an important and a necessary skill, not only, by the way, for experienced nurses, for master nurses, but for novice nurses. They were, in fact, at this point, being required to use clinical judgment skills at their level and scope of practice, but they were being required to do it. And we looked at every single item we had in the NCLEX, determined, are we measuring it? And not only that, are we measuring it well? And you know what? We determined we were measuring it indirectly, but we weren't measuring it directly because we were limited by the type of exam we were giving. And that this provided more evidence for us that we certainly, and it was evidence-based, that we needed both additional research and a look at new item types. And thus was born the next generation NCLEX project that I'm going to show you. So next slide. So when I go into this, I want you to understand, particularly around this, we are not building an education model. David was talking about education. What we're building is a measurement model that can be used in education, but it isn't a pedagogy. We didn't develop a pedagogy. We didn't develop a plan of instruction. We developed ways to measure the instruction that's already being given. And so that's very important because early on there was confusion that we were building a new teaching model. And that simply isn't true. The teaching models, the literature showed us, already existed. What we needed to do was build a measurement model that could be used in any of the teaching models so that educators could in fact measure well, and so could we, the ability of their students to apply clinical judgment. Next slide. All right, so I get it. Busy model. It also scared my psychometricians because generally when you build a measurement model, it's very linear. But we thought about this and we said it's important for us to meet two needs here in this measurement model. You have a regulatory need, and that regulatory need is for me to tell the regulatory body that in fact the individual that I am giving them scores in have at least minimal competence in clinical judgment. By the way, that's layer one of this model. But what's missing in there is feedback to the educators so that they could actually get feedback. I put it this way: if student graduates in an education program, and they take our test and they fail. I know who they're going to call, and by the way, I know it's not me. They're going to probably call their educator, and they're going to say, I got this report back from the counselor that says that I'm not really good at clinical judgment. Can you help me? And my thought was, if I were that educator, I'd go, well, show me your report. And they show you a report, and you go, yep, you're no good at clinical judgment. That's what they said. Well, what do I do about that? I guess you need to go learn clinical judgment. And if I was an educator, I'd go, or the student, I go, well, that's what you were supposed to teach me. And you would say, I did. And my point was, I can't give you as an educator any information that would help you give them feedback so they could focus their remediation. So I wanted to build a model that allowed the regulator to get their information, but the educator to get feedback so it would improve and help them with their students. So sort of as an assistance to them. And so we built a layer 3, which broke down the steps of what we were measuring. So we would be measuring recognized cues. If you actually look at the bottom, we also tied in the nursing process, because basically, what is clinical judgment? It is the nursing model. Therefore, how do we measure the nursing model? And this is the way we propose to do it. And so you had recognized cues, that's an assessment. Analyze cues is analysis. Prioritize and generate solutions is planning. Take action is implementation, and outcomes is evaluate outcomes is evaluation. And so we said, now we've got to make sure we have items that can actually measure that in a way that gives us valuable information. Oh, and we need to make our exams more like real life. So there's always, you can write multiple choice questions. I get that. They measure well. But one of the problems is the way we tell you to write multiple choice questions, because psychometricians don't like dirt. Not real dirt. They don't like dirt in their items because it's got all sorts of variability that they can't explain. So when we write items, we write what I call sterile items. We make sure you take every bit of irrelevant information out of your item. And so we know we're measuring one thing. And I said, let's put dirt back in the item and figure out how to measure it, because the reality as a nurse, if I walk into a client room, I don't just get relevant information. I walk in and there is all sorts of information, of which it's my responsibility to determine what's relevant to the current situation in front of me. So is the color of the wall relevant? I don't know, maybe, but it's contextual, right? So we built a layer 4 that said we've got to put this dirt, this contextual dirt, back into the items and make sure that that is more like real life, more like what our nurses really experience when they're performing client care. Next slide. And so when we looked at the items, we said, okay, the current items don't do that. So what did we do? I brought in experts in 21st century skill from all over the world to a 3-day workshop. And then I brought in, as a second team, technology developers. All right, so I sent the technology developers to the hotel room and said, you get to sleep all day because you're going to get to work all night. And I brought the skills people in and said, your job today is to develop as many new item types. Just draw them out however you can, of how we can measure these skills. How do we do that? How do I measure hypothesis generation? So they worked all day, but at the end of the day, we wallpapered the wall with probably 100 to 120 different ideas, took those ideas, started categorize them. We got down into about 8 to 10 different item types. And then I sent them home. And no, I didn't send them home. I sent them back to the hotel and said, sleep well because I need you tomorrow. And then I brought in the technology guys, handed them these items and said, okay, you've got 8 hours to build a prototype for us. Build it so I can show this to these individuals, these experts tomorrow morning, of how their item would look in a technology-driven world. So could we even do that? So we actually were able to do that. And in the end, those item types were pared down to about 4 or 5, which now are what we call the prototypes for the NCLEX, meaning that the items I'm going to get ready to show you and what they look like have been determined to be successful through all our research in measuring the model I just previously showed you and providing the ability to give you feedback as educators and give you confidence as regulators that the measurement around clinical judgment necessary for safe practice is being measured validly and reliably. And so keep in mind the goal is to keep the NCLEX as reliable as it's always been, to ensure it is as valid as it's always been, add the fidelity as much as possible back into these items, and keep it in a CAT format. So those were the four pillars that said this has got to happen. And so we've developed items, and I want to show those to you now. Next slide. All right. First off, the content of this item isn't as important to me or you because these are prototypes. They haven't went through any sort of eval on content. But I want mostly, if you would, focus on the prototype. What you're looking at here is how all the new NCLEX NGN, clinical judgment items, will look. So you'll notice that's way different than your straight multiple choice item. So if you look, as you look at the screen, if you look to the left side, you will have basically a client care chart. So there will be tabs for history, physicals, notes, vital signs, lab results. And those will follow the individual through a scenario. So they always have it with them. They can look at anything they want as this scenario unfolds in front of them. Now, on the other side is where the real question is at. So for instance, in this case, if you look over here, you'll see this thing called drag. This is called a drag and drop, but it's an enhanced drag and drop. Why? Because when we looked at all of our drag and drops, and if there's educators listeners out there listening, I would tell you probably most years look this way. Why do you use drag and drop? It's to put things in order. So you say, please tell the right order to put these steps in to complete the skill. That's generally what they are. So we've said, let's enhance that. And you take this client chart over here. They need to evaluate what's in that client chart. And then they need to drag the assessment findings that require immediate follow-up. So you'll see there's 7 or 8 here. There are only so many, if they do the correct evaluation, that need immediate follow-up. And they would know it needs immediate follow-up because the client record is right there. So this is sort of the big picture. I'm going to break it down in each of the boxes so you see how it looks. But remember that this grows. So the first question on the left-hand side might only have a nursing note and a history and physical. But as lab results come in, as vital signs are added, they keep being added to this client record grows. Next slide. And so you can see here, they can click on any one of these and they'll come up. So this is your history and physical. Notice in the history and physical, it's everything that would have been in that history and physical. Some of it's relevant, some of it's not, but it all exists. That's different than the items today where we take all irrelevant information out. This would be a true history and physical. Next slide. Nurse's note. If there's only one nurse's note, you'll see it here. But this will be a progressive. So over time, they'll say there'll be an hour in here, and then 2 hours later, there'll be a timestamp that says a new one was entered in this, and a new one, just like in real life. Go to vital signs. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. So they'll have a vital signs. This again could be progressive. There could be 3 sets of vital signs in here. They would be timed and they would know a progression of vital signs right at their fingertips. Go to next slide. Laboratory results. This is a big change, okay? So notice we're going to give the lab results, but we're going to give the reference range. Why? Because you don't, in fidelity, do you all remember the reference range? Probably if you've been in the field a long time, but everybody has a phone or a reference sheet that can check that out. By the way, the lab results from the pharmacy or from the lab that come back actually have them there anyway. So that's what reality is. So we provide it. All right. So all of the information that should be there will be there to answer the questions. Next slide. So if you're looking at recognized cues, what is that box? That box is, think about this. Oh, I should say, so you're picturing this. These are not independent questions. They will be scenarios, and the scenario will have at least 6 questions in it. No, it will have a maximum of 6 questions in it. Might have less, but a maximum of 6. And it will attempt to measure the boxes. But remember, in the nursing process, if you think about it, the nursing process is not linear. And when I talk to most educators, they say absolutely it's not. It is written in a linear fashion, but it becomes cyclical because you may go all the way out to planning care, get more data, and you jump back to grabbing more assessment. You don't simply walk all the way through and say, all right, let's evaluate if that worked. You didn't, let's start all over again. We know that it sort of cycles through it, and it's iterative. And so this design will allow us to do scenario testing over the range of an unfolding case, wherever it may take it. So at least 6 items. So recognize cues. What is in there? It's figuring out which information is relevant or irrelevant, because that's what we have to do. What information is most important? What is of immediate concern? So I'll give you an example of a question that kind of gets to that. Next slide, please. So remember, there's a whole left side of the screen. I'm not showing it to you. I'm only showing you the right side. So you have this left side of the screen. An assessment would be findings that require immediate follow-up. You have got the clues. You're recognizing cues. So you're telling me I know those things, right? I know what's relevant, what's not relevant. There's all sorts of information in here. Some of it's relevant to the candidate, some not, or to the client, some not. Next slide. So in your analyzing clues, now you're going, what client conditions are consistent with the cues? Are there cues that support or contraindicate particular conditions? What particular cue or subset is of concern? These are things that we as nurses would do while we're analyzing our cues. And so next slide. Here is what another type of drag and drop, but basically it says here are the potential issues. And what you're going to do is drag the potential issue that the client is at risk for. So you have all their information. You're going to start saying they're at risk for 2 or 3 of these things. I'm going to get the scoring just a little bit, but keep in mind that you can't score these the same way. How are you going to score these items? They're not easy. And how are we going to do that? Next slide. The next thing you're going to do is prioritize those hypotheses. So you've got your cues, you've analyzed your cues. In analyze your cue, you're getting a hypothesis. So how are you going to prioritize? So you're going to make you're going to get a bunch, you're going to hypotheses, and you rank them in some way. So which explanations are most likely, least likely, or what are the possible explanations for this? That tells you their thinking. How are they thinking through this process? Next slide. So we developed a close item. I got to tell you, so far you haven't seen any new item types. You're just seeing us use them differently. I don't know how old you are, most of you, but I do. I know how old I am, and I know there was a magazine way back in time called the Highlights magazine. And if you remember in the Highlights magazine, there was always somewhere near the middle of the magazine, it was a kids magazine, there was this place called Goofus and Gallant. And you would walk through a whole story, and you would go through a sentence, and you'd come to a place where you had to pick Goofus or Gallant. And if you pick Goofus, the next one you had to go is what would Goofus actually do versus what would Gallant actually do? So this is a play on that same thing, and it's called a close item. And what you need to do, remember, you still got the left side of the screen, and you're going to say the nurse should first address the clients, and you'll get a drop down. And followed by that. That's one way to do it. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I think this is not the drop down. So if you'll go back a slide, I'm sorry, I want to talk just a little bit more about this so they're not confused. This could go on for 4 or 5 drop downs because you're following their logic through the prioritizing of hypothesis. So you could have 5 or 6 of these drop downs. in a single item, because that is how the think aloud process went when we did this. So this is a way to follow their logic through thinking around prioritizing hypotheses. Next. Then you'll generate solutions. That sort of is understandable. Next slide. Because you'll have these slides later. I won't read all that to you, but those posters are what we use for item writing. The ones you're seeing before each of these items, we actually use that when we teach item writing. Now, this is called a matrix item, and notice what it allows you to do. This one allows you to, for each potential order, so in that left side of the screen, there would have been orders. And so for each potential order, the nurse now needs to say, is the potential order anticipated? Is it non-essential, or is it contraindicated? And notice that in each line, they can only select one. You can't say something is anticipated but contraindicated. So they'd be locked down to one selection choice. But notice how many lines there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 different possible answers. And if you think about how you score this, you can't score this simply right or wrong. And I wanted to use this slide to talk about that, because that means I can get 7 of these right and 1 wrong, and I get no point. So the problem that we run into is when you think about the way we're now writing items is that let's assume that 3 of us go in and we're taking a test. And the first person in the room gets it right. The second one gets it wrong. And I, the third person, get it wrong. The problem with the scoring of today is that because we score everything absolutely right or absolutely wrong, is not the person who got it right, their score is accurate. But guess what score both the person who got it wrong, and by the way, they didn't kill anybody, but my choice killed somebody. Guess what? We get the same ability estimate. And fundamentally on the surface, we know that's not true. I mean, I was much more dangerous than the other person who got that wrong. So how do you address that now? How do you address that with 8 different categories, and can you do it reliably? The answer is we can. We figured out how to score it. It does use partial credit scoring. So I will tell you this, we will be moving to partial credit scoring on all items of this nature, and all the items I've shown you up to this point require some partial credit scoring to make them work and be reliable and valid. So the nice thing about that is we get a lot more information on every item about a candidate, and so we're able to give a much more stable score along the spectrum of ability as opposed to right or wrong. So next slide. So then taking action, obviously there's 2 things here: which intervention should happen and how should the intervention be accomplished. So there's 2 things you can do here is which is the intervention, or how are you going to do the intervention? Next slide. And so this fundamentally is nothing different than a multiple choice item. But remember that in our multiple choice items, we restrict it to only 5 or 6. Notice that we now can go, because we're using partial credit scoring better, we can say you need to just select all that apply. So I could have, I believe, as our model holds together, up to 9 choices. So up to 9 choices in any one of these can be asked. Again, giving a lot more information about the candidate, how they answer right or wrong, but does require partial credit scoring. Next slide. And then evaluating that stands by itself. This is another one of the posters we use when we're doing item writing. Next slide. Here is what we call an enhanced hotspot. And so remember, you've got this client chart over here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, I can take any portion of that client chart, put it over here, and I can now say, I need you, given that this is what the progress note says, or nurse's note, or whatever. I need you to highlight the findings in this paragraph or in this lab result. Those findings that indicate this client is not progressing or is progressing, right? So now, instead of a multiple choice, they have to pick out sentences or words that indicate that they actually understand and that this client is not progressing because of this progress note. Something a bit more realistic in terms of, since we can't right now have a nursing handoff report, they can certainly read something like this and determine both relevant, irrelevant, what is a downward trending sign, what's not, and they can do that merely by clicking and highlighting phrases that say, this is why I believe this client is not progressing. Next slide. So, what is the test going to look like? Well, first off, I am going to tell you that the test itself, which we believe will launch in April of 2023, will have the majority of NCLEX items exactly the same as they are. So remember, nursing isn't just clinical judgment. I said it covered about 65% of all of the tasks, but there are other tests that still need to be measured, and our items do that well. And so you're going to have a CAT exam just like it is today. You're going to have the majority of the items still be NCLEX items, but you're going to have anywhere from 2 to 5 scenarios inserted into that exam with these item types. And there will also be what we call standalone items that can actually just be put in the exam. But in terms of scenarios, they'll be anywhere between 2 and 5. That'll get finalized a little bit later in the year. We're still working on the research to be able to tell you exactly, so I can only tell you a range right now. But it's somewhere between 2 and 5. And I can tell you our research suggests the exam's going to be somewhere between 130 and 150 total items, not 265 anymore, because we're able to get a lot more information so we can test faster. The scoring and the scaling will be exactly the same. Nothing's changing. So really what you're going to see is basically a test that might go from 1 to 150 items instead of 130, which would be an increase of 20 of what it is right now. And that you'll see these new item types, but the actual experience pretty much the same. Next slide. The scoring of the items I've already told you, they are going to be partial credit scored. And that's true of even the new NCLEX, of the old NCLEX items. So we're going to shift the scoring model. So multiple choice items where you had to get them all right in order to get any credit for the item will move to partial credit as well, because 1, there's more information, and 2, it's the right thing to do. So we will be making that move as well. Overall, again, we get more information per question by using partial credit scoring, so it's really, really good that way. And next slide. These next few slides are just about resources, so I won't read them to you because I want to make sure I can answer questions. But if we'll go through these slides, I'll talk briefly about a couple of resources that are always there for you. And if you look at this slide, don't have to write it down because I'm understanding you're going to get to see them later. But this gives you the roadmap. So if you go to ncsbm.org, at the top of the page, you click NCLEX, and you look down in this yellow, you'll see Next Generation NCLEX Project. If you click on that, this is where all the resources reside. If you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to tell you what some of those are. And so those resources include quarterly newsletter. By the way, if you don't want to actually go to the website and get that, you can just have it delivered to you every quarter by clicking on our site and enrolling, opting in to be mailed to you. You'll find presentations and talks. So anything we've recorded on this, you can go out and look at. It's out there. There's FAQs that probably answer many of your questions. And the In Focus article that Nancy Spector writes, there's a couple of articles in it that we would ask you. But the one thing I would say, if you hear things from other sources, please go to this site to verify that. And if it can't be verified that, there's a place for you to ask your question and we will get you the answer. Because we keep updating this on a regular basis as research rolls in. So please, this is a really good site to know exists and get to when you have questions, or someone, one of your students or anybody else has questions, send them here. They'll get the most up-to-date information. Next slide. And we also have NGN Talks. This could get a little boring because this is a progressive. So as we started research, we started these talks. You can go back to the beginning and walk the journey with us if you want. But there are these NCN Talks that are sort of like TED Talks, Pod Talks, whatever you want to call them. That's what these are. They're very informative, but they walk you through the journey from the very beginning. Next slide. And we have these publications that are out there that are part of the things I already talked to you about earlier on. But go out here, if you'll link onto these resources, these are the published articles in peer-reviewed literature that you can use to look at our research as well. Next slide. And the other thing that you'll find out there, also we send out and advertise well, we continue to do educational opportunities related to webinars, WebEx presentations, obviously in the COVID world. Before we were doing in-person presentations, aren't able to do that now. We are, I can tell you, working on item writing seminars that we hope to launch next year as well, so you can learn to write some of these items. And so this is all out there too, but these are all, again, at that one site. If you go there, you'll find all of this. Next slide. And with that, because I wanted to make sure there's enough time for me to answer any of your questions, I'll open it up to questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dickinson. Are there questions from the board members?
I see one here, which I'll read if you don't mind. It says, when you say 2 to 5 scenarios, each scenario can have a max of 6 questions and can be of any of the new item types. So yes, 2 to 5 scenarios means that each of those scenarios could have a max of 6 questions, and it would probably be a mix of any of those item types. So it wouldn't be a single item type through all of those. It'll be a mix.
Are you beta testing these questions right now for students that are taking the NCLEX?
Yes. So we started beta testing 24 months ago with the RNs, and we started beta testing with the PNs in October. So right now I'm waiting. We've had a month of beta test with the PNs. Let me back up and just tell you the RNs, so you know this, because the trend seems to be the same early on with the PNs. I had hoped to get around, from a power analysis, about 5,000 participants to take the beta test. We, at the RN level right now, we've had over 360,000 participants. There's a point as a researcher you want to go yay, yuck, but yay because you really have a lot of data, yuck because you really have a lot of data and you need to do something with it. But it has been fascinating to get that data. And the early and the PNs, I'll tell you how we're getting it, but early in the PN, the participation rate in October was that just slightly over 70% of all PNs taking the NCLEX exam were participating in the data collection. That's a big number, okay? Yeah. So how does it work? Let me tell you how it works so you know how we're doing that. So everybody who takes every candidate who is taking their exam currently, okay? If they're taking their exam, when their NCLEX exam is done as a PN, and they have more than 30 minutes left in their max time, they are given an opportunity to opt in and take what is called a research section. If they opt in, then they are provided a form 10 items that they take. And we then use their response data and their survey data at the end to help inform us of how well the items are working. So, like I said, we're through 1 month. I have the data for 1 month, and it was about 70% of all PN candidates actually participated. If that continues, we will have, PNs are lower number for us, but we'll have in the 100 and I don't know, probably 120,000 participants times 10. So that's 1 million data points sometime in the next 9 to 12 months.
Okay, that was pretty impressive. Are there other questions for Dr. Dickinson?
Hi, this is Donna. I don't have a question, but thank you for the presentation. I'm really excited about this. I can see how you're going to get a much better, we'll get a much better understanding of the critical thinking power. And also, I think this test really does spur the nurse taking the test to really think things through as opposed to just trying to choose an answer. So I'm excited about this.
Thank you. Someone is asking if I'll repeat the proposed changes to the PN exam. I want to make sure when I say this, these are not decided yet. These are where I think minimums and maximums are at, given that the research we already have. But remember, we still have a lot more data to get, okay? So we do believe that the exam will be somewhere between 100, maximum length 130 to 150 items. And the minimum length, I don't think I told you this, I'll give you it, will be somewhere between 60 and 80 items.
Okay.
And that the total length of the exam will be somewhere around 5 hours. Those are all, again, proposed. They have to be evidence-based, and I'm still waiting for the confirmatory evidence to make sure that works. But that's where I think it's heading to right now.
For our board members, can you tell them right now what the numbers are that we're dealing with right now as to how many questions a student can get and how many max length they have?
So you know that I guess I should say right now, because in COVID, we shortened the exam. It used to be 265 items. And during COVID, we did a significant amount of analysis in trying to increase the ability to get capacity. So instead of every 5 to 6 hours a new candidate, how could we maintain the reliability of the exam and shorten it so we could have people testing in 4 hours, all right? So we were able to do that. So I'm going to talk about that exam. It's been very successful, and there's no reason that we would change it as successful as it's been. So currently there is a minimum of 60 items on the test. So a minimum length test, everybody takes at least 60. The maximum length test is 130 items today. And the maximum time is 4 hours for the test, and we added an hour on for the research section and experimental items. So a candidate could be in the room for at least 5 hours. Their exam maxes out at 4 hours, or they take 130 items. Does that help? Or did I confuse it?
No, I think that was very helpful. Thank you. Are there other questions?
I think I answered this, but I'll read it off. Courtney Moody, changes were made to the NCLEX to shorten it for the COVID. Will the changes just be effective for COVID only or after? The measurement around the shortened exam has been very stable and consistent with the 6-hour exam. So there is no reason why we would require someone to sit there for 6 hours. There is no point. No, that's not right. There is no reason at this point in time that we would consider moving back to a 6-hour exam or a 5-hour exam. Well, I should say a 6-hour exam. We do have a 5-hour exam because of the research section.
Other questions or comments? Thank you for those comments that are in the chat room. And thank you so much, Dr. Dickinson. This was an excellent presentation. I hope it helped clear some things up for the board members as well. Other comments? Okay, we are a little bit early, so, oh wait, here's another one.
Yep.
I'm having technical audio issues, but I'm wondering how we're working with the nursing schools to ensure they are preparing our potential new nurses to pass the new and improved critical thinking test.
So when they say we, do they mean you or me?
Probably you, but this is the second time I've heard your presentation, so members of the board know that Dr. Dickinson is going around to director conferences. That's where I heard it the first time. And every time I hear it, I get a little bit more out of it and I appreciate it. So that's one way where schools are learning about it and we're sharing information with each other. And of course, we have the NCSBN website as our resource.
And the other thing I would say that, and I think it's on December 3rd, we're meeting with the Education Publishing Group to provide them with insight so that they can build tools to help. As I think you've heard me say, is it Carol? I think, well, anyway, I had in other presentations that was one of the goals, is that we would work with educational publishers so that they could help the educators with tools and products and those sort of things to help them as well. You're right, we were traveling around a lot. That has come to a stop at the moment. But anybody in California could request for us to put on a virtual event for them by simply going to that site and requesting it, okay?
I'll put in a plug for the class you guys have on test writing.
Yeah.
That's on the NCSBN website, which I took that class several years ago, and I've encouraged my faculty, especially during this time of COVID, when they are doing everything online, to take that class, and we're paying for it at Sac City College. So it's an excellent class and really can help educators prepare students because they know how to write the items more efficiently and more in line with what's going on with NCLEX.
Yes.
Other questions or comments?
Actually, if I may, this is Elaine Yamaguchi, and I wanted to respond a little bit to Ms. Rooks. That actually, of the 100 or so people attending, a lot of them are with the schools and programs. So our NECs have been following along with NCSBN's work on the next gen and NCLEX, and of course they're all assigned to for a variety of the schools. So we're working on it. In other words, I think, and if any of the NECs want to chime in at this point, but basically I think the ongoing conversations as the NECs work with the schools is essentially we're looking at how do we help the schools and programs to basically to mold their curriculum. So this is really what today's conversation and the ones we hope to have in the coming months is really aimed at doing.
Thank you, Elaine. Other comments? Any of the NECs, did you want to make a comment? Okay, seeing no comments, I wonder if we want to take a 10-minute break before we have Mr. Cordova. So I think that we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock. That gives people a chance to stand up, stretch your legs for a minute, and then we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock to start our presentation from Mr. Cordova.
This is the moderator. Everybody, this is the moderator. The meeting is now back in session and being recorded.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to take this opportunity to reintroduce again Mr. John Cordova from Health Workforce. John, are you on?
I am here. Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So good to have you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Do you want me to just go ahead and get started, Dr. Mountain?
Does it look like everybody's back?
Yes, this is the moderator. It does look like everybody is back.
Then, John, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Dr. Mountain, for inviting me today to talk to this group. I appreciate the invitation. For those of you who are not familiar with my name, I am John Cordova. I'm the statewide director for the Health Workforce Initiative, which is a program through the Community College Chancellor's Office, Economic and Workforce Development. We work with all 115 community colleges and their allied health and nursing programs throughout the state. The group of us consists of 12 people, one person from the State Chancellor's Office, who is our project monitor, and then we have 10 regional directors throughout the state that work with regions. Many of the people who are working with the community college programs may be familiar with. So we have representation to help out with not only community colleges, but also work out with other programs, adult ed, private education, to align programs throughout the regions. Part of my conversation today and my invitation is to talk a little bit about 2 points of view, as really looking at simulation and some of the curriculum redesign based on how we've been responding to the COVID. If I'm correct, or if I'm incorrect, please correct me, Dr. Mountain or Elaine. So I didn't propose any kind of presentation because I wanted to just kind of talk about this in general, about how simulation is being used and what simulation is. And I'm not familiar. I see many names on the attendees list, some of them from many of the colleges that are represented from the community colleges, and I'm thankful to have them on board. I really wanted to, let's look at simulation and some of the proposed things that we need to look at for moving forward in our design, and not just in our LVN or Psych Tech programs, but across the board for all allied health. And given this pandemic and the need to answer to the call of our students' success in their programs and they're meeting their clinical objectives per requirements in the legislation and law, we had to look at how to quickly identify how to meet those student learning outcomes for the clinical. And as you know, simulation was one of the ways that we actually did that. And I do want to thank the board of Vocational Nursing and Psychiatric Technician Board for your flexibility in helping programs help students be successful during this pandemic, because without the flexibility of the board and allowing programs to be able to adjust to what we need to do to make students have students successfully complete, it wouldn't have been without your oversight. So we do appreciate that on behalf of the programs. And speaking about simulation, when we talk about simulation, simulation can be many things, and I think that programs have done an excellent way of facilitating different aspects of simulation to meet the needs of the students in this pandemic. But as we move on into, past this pandemic and even prior to this, we look at how do we use simulation and how we use simulation successfully and deliberately for students' learning outcomes. One of the things, and I'll kind of give you a step back, is that prior to my role in working with the Health Workforce Initiative, I actually was in simulation and I ran 2 simulation labs, and I know that one of the programs is on here from Rio Hondo and also Mount San Antonio College, where we took a simulation program that was based in one course and developed it into the full program of all multi-programs, not just nursing, not just LVN, but psych tech and respiratory therapy, EMT. So we looked at how do we not only train our disciplines to learn in simulation, but also do interdisciplinary and learn about other people's roles are when they're working in these simulation experiences. And when we look at simulation, we're looking at what we call simulated clinical experiences. And those are, it's just that. It's a simulated clinical experience. It's not the real thing. It does not replace the hands-on experience. However, when simulation is done in a very deliberate way, it can meet the learning outcomes of the students and actually prepare students for the real life situations. And I can give you some examples of that in a little bit. But when we look at simulation, we figure out how do we incorporate this into our programs. Now, simulations can come in different things. You can actually just have we have done simulation many years where some of you who are nurses know that we used to have an orange, and we used to simulate the orange as a patient's arm to do an injection. That's a form of simulation. Has simulation changed from them? Yes, we've gone way out there. I know that sometimes we were doing simulated TVs with hot dogs and stuff. We've moved from that into new fields of looking at virtual simulation, where we actually have human. We have the mannequin arms. We have various tools out there to really expand the clinical skills for students. However, it's how you use that, because there's one way of teaching a skill on some of these pieces of equipment or this technology, but there's also that part of applying knowledge and critical thinking skills for that particular patient. And from my experience, I've actually had to use simulated clinical experiences designed in everything from CNA programs, like I said, to EMT programs, paramedic programs, vocational nursing, psych tech, and for RN programs alike. And once we already started doing that, then we started combining those simulated clinical experiences so that it can actually work with interdisciplinary during the scenarios. But looking at simulation, again, we look at virtual simulation also. In this remote learning environment, we have to really get creative, and there's a lot of programs out there that actually provide avatars or those types of online it's like a video game in a sense. You see kids who are playing these video games and doing that. It's the same thing in simulation, where it puts you into that area and you're actually avatar taking care of a patient in some kind of fashion. There's also VR, which is virtual reality, where you're actually using the goggles and putting on the goggles and can actually go in and feel like you're into a patient's room taking care of a patient through the virtual glasses. In addition to that is the immersive simulation, where you are walking into a plain room, but there's a simulator there or a standardized patient there, and the room is basically a camera that's posting a screenshot of what it's like to be in a patient's room, and you have access to touch things and stuff on the wall that's not really there. It's simulated, but that you're able to turn the dial for oxygen, to put oxygen onto the patient. So simulation comes in various ways to be able to incorporate into your programs and how you use them. But again, it's how you use them effectively, and to make sure that it's deliberate to meet the intent of the clinical objective. And it's not there just to have a, oh, wow, eyes and ears type of thing. It's more to meeting the intent of the clinical objective for that particular student and that course. And I'm going to tell you, increasing simulation into programs is not as simple as it sounds. It takes time to plan. It takes time to plan with the subject matter experts for those particular courses to look at what clinical objectives you need to meet, what type of simulated clinical experience do we develop, or do we use, or do we alter to meet that need. And then the real learning happens in the debriefing session, when we're actually looking at post what the students experience. How do they experience the simulator? What did they learn from? What did they do wrong? What can they learn and when they go into the real setting? And from experience with students that I've had in the past, we've actually done some really strategic simulated clinical experiences with the students, and students. I don't want to say they cried, but close to. But they learned, and during our debriefing session, they really learned about how to take care of a patient. And students have come back to us and said, I'm so grateful that I learned this either in this program or I learned this last week in simulation because this happened to my patient last week and I knew what to do. I knew how to respond. I knew how to react. And they're able to develop those critical thinking skills. So I want to say when we look at simulation, we have to make sure that that we have it very deliberate in how we're going to meet clinical objectives, but also there's a need for standardization. And I think this is where the boards come into play, is because as we move into this new era of using simulation as some of the clinical opportunities, and who knows how we're going to respond to this pandemic, the need for clinical simulation is going to be continuing as we sometimes have decreased accessibility to the clinical sites. And how do we really embody the intent of a simulated clinical experience for this meeting the outcomes of the students in the clinical? So talking about standardization and how does that move across the board? From our perspective, from the Health Workforce Initiative, we're trying to provide as many resources as we can. During this pandemic, we actually helped provide several different types of resources, as many opportunities as we could, with free online resources. But simulation is costly, and it does cost money to get these high fidelity simulators. But it also costs students if we don't have qualified trained faculty, and just especially subject matter experts in OB or peds or mental health or critical care. There should be a push for a subject matter expert in simulation. And part of that is so that there's a increased standardization across the board of having that subject matter expert, knowing that they can walk them through, is this meeting your intent and your clinical objective? How do we take simulation and understand the standards that we're trying to meet, and does that align with your clinical outcomes? So part of that is to really look at what's already available or what's not available, and how do we build that, and how do we share some of these resources. And I know that working with Health Impact and their Simulation Alliance, they actually were very, very great, and during the pandemic released all their simulated clinical experiences for free for everybody to download and use during that time, because we had to come up with something. But it still comes back down to having qualified a subject matter expert that knows what simulation is and how to actually implement it into a program. And I think that moving forward, we really need to look at how do we embrace that a little bit more. And I don't only think that the faculty or the teachers need to have that training. I think also the NECs need to have that training so that they understand and know that when I'm proposing to do these types of simulated clinical experiences, that the NEC also understands and knows what they're trying to do in that attempt. So I think it goes both ways in that experience with simulation. And there's a large organization, the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, that has these certifications already for educators and operations specialists that they can actually use. And they also have a means to have a simulation center as a standardized certified simulation center. And I have to just step back and say, you don't have to have a $500,000 simulation center. You don't have to do that. I started both of my simulation centers at both the colleges. I started them in a faculty office. So with I had no desk in the office. There was a bed and a patient simulator, and that's how I started the simulation program, and grew it and grew it and grew it. And so I think that part of that was because I was the SME for simulation and working with the other program and with other subsequent extras in the program, we were able to build out how to develop the SCEs for each part of the program. And then additionally, we actually were able to build out those that need to be remediated for a different scenario, or those that failed to meet, had to do a makeup day for missing a clinical. We were able to look at how do we create these other scenarios so that it's still meeting the intent. We're not duplicating scenarios. We're not using the same things. And then we actually formatted a way to alter so that students from semester to semester doesn't come back and say, hey, this is what we did last semester. This is what you need to look for. We altered them so that students had changes and they couldn't do what we know students do. So that's any questions related to simulation before I kind of talk a little bit about curriculum stuff.
Any questions from the board? We might think of some afterwards.
Okay. So as we look at simulation, again, part of I think the conversation is looking at, recommendation is maybe developing a task force from the board assigns to look at simulation and simulation implementation throughout the state for these programs, and really looking at how do we design simulation in these areas. But we also need to have the same definition of what simulation is. I threw a bunch of terms out to you, but there needs to be an adoption of this is what simulation is. This is how we are looking at defining that, and then what is it that we are moving forward and collectively understand. And I think a task force would help do that, and we'll be more than happy to help facilitate that in any way with the health workforce team if that's the case. I think also as we look at simulation and in relation to curriculum redesign, I know that you've talked about some of the information about nursing education issues and next generation and NCLEX. One of the things that our group has done as we developed a community of practice with LVN programs throughout the state, and trying to look at where are the needs for programs throughout the state, what do they have troubles for, what are the areas of interest, and collectively many of the programs have stated that the curriculum standards for their programs are outdated because of practice. LVN's practice is much different than it was before, and maybe to take a look at developing a statewide job analysis on the LVN to see what is the current practice that they're doing, where are the current practice settings that they're working at, and collectively looking at that overall scope of job duties as far as what they're doing, and then coming back and taking a look at and providing that a report to the board and saying, here's the current state of practice based on working LVNs out there, and how do we need to look at making changes in the curriculum redesign for meeting the actual intent of what LVN are doing and practicing out in the real world. Along with that is looking at how the simulation can also increase some of those learning opportunities for LVNs that are working in other areas of the state that might not have access to regular patients in that arena. So, one area we know that LVNs have little to no access in the OB area, and so how do we continue to create those clinical experiences for the programs currently now for OB rotations when we know that most LVNs are not working in any kind of OB acute care setting? So how do we change some of that and meet that intent? And so part of that is looking at maybe a job analysis. How do we really look at the whole job responsibilities and duties that LVNs do in the current state now and moving forward. So that's one, another proposition of recommendation we can actually take a look at. I'm looking at a question here. It says, for schools that do not find a clinical site due to COVID-19, what happens? Is the board willing to do 75% simulation and 25% clinical for the students to meet the clinical criteria for the board? And that's something that I think I have to throw back to you, Elaine, that I can't answer. And for students that do not find a clinical site, what happens? Is the board willing to allow students to complete 75% simulation and 25% clinical for students who meet the clinical criteria? And again, I can't speak on behalf of the board. That's something that you have to respond to.
Dr. Mountain, do you want me to reply or would you like to reply?
I would love it if you'd reply to that, Elaine, but I'll chime in if there's something additional.
Great. Thank you for the question, because as I think you might imagine, that's not the first time we've heard this kind of question over this past year. The whole of the ratio of simulation to a live clinical experience has been one of those things that, and it was an issue before COVID, but it's been an especially big issue this past year. It's something that we're continuing to discuss, and I think at a certain point we're also going to be probably imposing on our friends at NCSBN to really look at that, because I think the common wisdom from other states and BRN and others has been that 50% simulation has been the appropriate maximum. But it may vary from subject matter to subject matter. It may vary from location to location. So we haven't decided whether or not we need to put in a regulatory limit or maximum or ceiling, if you will. And this is something that, again, we're starting this conversation today, and we hope to really work out. That's a huge issue that we must work out, and whether we do so as a rulemaking package or statutory language, we haven't quite figured out yet. But at this point in time, the board itself can't just say, yeah, 75% is great. But so, like I said, we want to make this, an ongoing conversation to really, I think, look at what the appropriate ratio is. And I think that it's never going to be that simple of a yes, no percentage, because as John was saying, the types of simulation are so very diverse. It's just not easy to quantify that. And so, like I said, it's and this is my long-winded way of saying we're talking about it, and we really want the programs to talk about that with their assigned NECs in a kind of collegial, here's what we think kind of way. But we're going to be moving forward. We're going to be having this conversation probably for the next year or so before we endeavor to, I think, make a policy.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you, Elaine, on that, in the sense that, from my personal experience, and this is I don't want to say this is an experience for everybody, and I don't want to say this is any particular program, but my experience when I was doing a lot of statewide stuff with simulation and going around and observing, and I was actually, doing a lot of consulting with programs at the time as well. I'd stood back to take a look at, okay, do your simulation, and then let me give you my feedback and recommendations of what needs to be changed. And it wasn't necessarily for people to hire me, because that was not my intent. I had a job. My job was that simulation was going to be used in a very deliberate way to meet clinical objectives. And again, it wasn't the intent to alleviate or eliminate, should I say, actual clinical experiences, because we can't. We have to have clinical experiences. But if we can simulate as close to as possible with a simulated clinical experience that's deliberately done to meet the intent of the clinical objectives, and it's not being used for skills. That's being done differently. It's developing the skills and learning skills is different than the simulation. We're actually, testing their knowledge and their competency in taking care of a patient in this given situation or scenario. So part of that is, people have asked me before about, well, do you think we should have 100% simulation, 75%? And I'm like, I'm not sure where we should have simulation, because again, we don't have standardization. What one person says, oh, we have a full simulation program, but are they meeting a certain standard? Are they meeting? And we don't have that collectively. And I think that needs to be maintained throughout the system, that the programs all agree to say, yes, we agree these are the standards that we all achieve for simulation, and that we all want to abide that the board then takes a look at and says, okay, maybe we need to make some legislation intent to Civic doesn't adopt this. But I think we need to look at it from the ground up with the programs and seeing one, what's being done, what's being used, because it's across the board. And when I see when I've observed a faculty member or a teacher sitting on the bed talking as the patient to the student who's the nurse taking care of the patient, well, you just lost the intent of the realism of simulation. You just don't do it that way. So when we have to be more effective in how we're actually and deliberate in how we're actually implementing a simulation program.
I just wanted to say too, I think this is the intent of where we're at right now. We are trying to open some dialogue and create conversation to look at exactly what John was saying, exactly what Elaine was saying, this idea that, are we going to say there's a minimum or a maximum? Are we going to provide some guidelines and some definitions for what we're doing with these education modalities, because they are going to continue to increase in the future, and we want to, if we're going to use them, we need to be using them to meet student learning objectives and to develop critical reasoning, not just to be play acting.
Exactly. And I know that especially during this pandemic, I can't even tell you how many emails I got during the pandemic from all these startups that are developing a simulated clinical experience or simulation program online. And part of that was I questioned the validity of it. I questioned how they came up with things so fast and how they developed it, and who was the subject matter expert to help develop such online programs in such a fastidious way. Not that it can't be done, but I didn't have the capacity to be able to examine every single one of those. But there are some standard programs out there. I mean, one of the questions was about patient charting, and one of the things that we did in our programs when we were doing simulation is that part of that is charting. Part of that is documenting what they've done with the patient, what they've observed, and so reporting out. So it's almost as if the student was in the hospital, and that's what we did. The student was in the hospital taking care of a patient, then they would have to let us know what's going on and report that, as they're documenting, or call the doctor for any labs or whatever. It was they were doing their role of what they learned up to that point in their program. And then we had several programs where we actually, the capstone was a full-blown, and I think Catherine Page is on here. We did a full-blown simulated clinical experience with the entire campus, where we had the paramedics, we had the fire department, we had the nursing students, we had other students who are standardized patients, we had the journalism students become reporters, and part of that was really putting them into that real life experience, but also understanding what their role was, how to work with other disciplines. But again, looking at each one of those disciplines, what What did they meet? And did we make sure that they were all met throughout? And so it takes planning, but it takes a lot of understanding to know that, because I'm not the subject matter expert in an EMT program or a paramedic program or a fire program, I need to know from that faculty member, what is it that the student needs? What are you looking for in this capstone, so that we can make sure that it's implied and met during that simulated clinical experience. So those are the things that we have to look at. And I know that there's other the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, there's the International for Nursing, NASCL, simulation clinical experiences. There's organizations, but what needs to happen is that we need to adopt within our community what standards we're going to meet for our programs. And I think that's where we have to look at what's available. We know there's studies done about the use of simulation, and those studies are really valid and say that simulation is a tool to help improve student learning outcomes. But it has to be done a certain way, and it has to be facilitated a certain way. So we need to continue to have that dialogue and how we're going to adopt that moving forward.
Any other questions about simulation? Okay, you want to move forward?
I have one more question. This says, looks like most of the clinical operations going forward will be virtual environment. How are we planning to accommodate such a need? And that probably comes back to the board. Can
you repeat that question?
It says, it looks like most of clinical operations going forward will be in virtual environment. How are we planning to accommodate such need?
I would want to know how they're defining virtual environment. So I have used the virtual headset where you wear the headset, and I actually put a catheter into a patient just in the air, but you feel like you're doing it. And that technology is really not fully developed. I think they have 2 or 3 skills that are really fully developed at this time. I think that we're going to see it grow, and that as we put these guidelines in place, we'll be able to better determine how effective it is to use virtual technology. Right now, it was a great experience for me to do a skill because I really felt like I was putting a catheter in, even though your brain tells you you're not doing that. You're doing it in the air, but it felt very real. But right now it's pretty skill based, and the idea that it's interactive with clients, that we're just not there yet. We just don't have that technology.
Right, and I think you bring up a very good point, Dr. Mountain, is about skill-related skill as opposed to the actual knowledge-based part about that. The clinical reasoning and clinical judgment and critical thinking. Those things are different than just doing the skill, and we have to make sure that when we're doing, if we're looking at just doing skills labs, that's a completely different look at things. When we're doing simulation or building clinical simulated experiences, those are intent. Those are very deliberate to meet, those student learning outcomes for that clinical, and are we meeting those objectives for the students for the knowledge and the reasoning, the critical thinking. So that's a good point. And I'll tell you, I'm a very big fan of simulation. I am. I don't think it needs to be at 75% yet, because I just don't think we're actually utilizing it to the highest potential that we can. And once we get to that point, then it might be consideration of that. But it's really looking at, are we meeting a standard? Do we have an evaluation process to make sure that the subject, the clinical simulated experiences is meeting that intent? And that's based on the subject matter expert, both the topic and also the simulated clinical expert. So we need to look at having those even certifications of faculty to be that SME. That's what my recommendation is looking at. And one of the things that we did is we try to propose that for all our programs throughout the state to get funding for. Unfortunately, the pandemic moved funds to other things, and so we couldn't get to move that forward. But one of the things we'd like to see is having that standardization of a certified health simulated educator at every college campus, so that there's a subject matter expert in simulation on every campus. What would be great.
And we're going to talk a little bit about some other modalities like telehealth and some of those things we.
Yes, I think with telehealth is also another area when we're talking about providing it's not necessarily simulations, but it's another way of in your curriculum redesign. One of the things that's been successful in your area, the state, Dr. Mountain, is we've developed a telehealth modules to help implement those into current training programs so that students are aware what telehealth services are and how that is. I was on a call this one day, and the topic was about telehealth services, and this is the call was from, I think it was the mayor's call. I've been on several different legislative calls this week, and the way that we met the care for many patients throughout the state was through. But again, looking at telehealth services and doing telehealth services is another way of looking at how do we provide this in a very deliberate way to meet the intent of what the patients need, not my intent of reaching out to the patient. It's what the patient's needs are, and how do we train our healthcare workforce to make sure that they understand what telehealth services are. Telehealth services also takes a different level of privacy and confidentiality, because of if you're doing telehealth services through if you're at home and you're doing telehealth services and you're online, and do you have people walking around in the background and hearing those sort of things? So a lot of other rules come into play when we're actually looking at those. The intent that physicians are reaching out through telehealth services for patient care also came to play, but also that the nursing for follow-up and for health, wellness, and prevention is also a topic of discussion on how we're going to be continuing to do that. Telehealth is not going to go away. It's going to continue. The conversation that we had the other day was that telehealth services is going to be a modality, but looking at how to do reimbursement for those telehealth services. I know many of the programs on here may have been participating in what we've collaborated with Vitas Healthcare to provide telehealth services for patients in the hospice care, which was a very successful project that we did in collaboration with. And I spoke with her yesterday, and she says that she was overwhelmed by how many programs across the state have applied to be part of that. But it's an alternative way to provide health services to patients. And I know when speaking with the Board of Nursing, they said telehealth services is a form of patient care. But again, we need to look at what is that patient care? What is that delivering? What are we doing as far as the scope of work and the scope and the level of work for each particular discipline? So we need to have a better conversation about how delivery of telehealth services can be applied in our programs. And because I see that we're going to probably have more contracts or more opportunities with the larger scale employers, which is the healthcare, health management organizations, to provide telehealth services to the many in a way that we can meet clinical intent, providing telehealth services and meeting objectives for our clinicals. So, but we have to take a good look at how we're going to do that. The modules that we have is just introduction into telehealth, and it probably needs to be a little bit more broader developed. But we did that. It was developed initially just to meet, helping programs to understand telehealth services and understand what that is. Because though it's new, it's not as new as we think it is. But we're able to reach out to healthcare providers on your phone as opposed to a phone call that we used to do. Or Zoom or other means that we can actually communicate. And that's granted that the broadband is available, or internet is available to those service delivery areas, where some services are provided at one location where patients can come to, and they take turns based on their appointment time to get the telehealth services, because they're so rural that they have no access to it, to the internet or broadband out there. So we got to take a really good look at how we're deliberately using that as part of our clinical objectives, and making sure that we have, again, some standards that we're meeting to meet the intent of those programs.
Once again, do we have any questions about telehealth or other different types of clinical that people have been considering or using, especially during the pandemic, to supplement? I think you've covered quite a few of them, John. I really appreciate it. But this was one of the things we wanted to just expose the board members to, is all these different modalities that are cropping up that people are using or considering as we try to get clinical experiences, especially during the pandemic. But what's going to happen in the future, and how will this impact nursing education, because healthcare itself is changing as we speak. I mean, it's all moving in a very different direction than we thought.
Right.
So, other questions from the board members? Any need for clarification, or members of the audience who would like to type a question in?
Yes, this is Cheryl Turner. So you were suggesting that we created some sort of task force to specifically address these issues, and work with stakeholders. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Yes, thank you, Cheryl, for that. I appreciate that. I think that if you have, I think a task force that is focusing on, these specific things, that actually engages, programs, and I would even increase, the students as part of that task force to really help design and identify what needs to be looked at, and what the recommendations from a task force moving forward. I gave a lot of different examples and a lot of different things. There may be things that are done in simulation, virtual or virtual reality, that may not apply to the practice of LVN or a psych tech. And so that might be something that the board says, we adopt this, but we're not going to adopt this or this, because it doesn't meet intent of clinical objectives based on the current regulations for curriculum. So, but I think the answer is yes. I think the task force needs to be identified, and really trying to drive and get some information to bring back to the board to look at and see, what are recommendations that a task force moves forward. I mean, I'm just doing generalized recommendations, but I think really a task force that helps drive that is probably best.
Appreciate it.
Other questions or comments? Other questions in general of all of the presentations that we've heard today? Anything that people would like to express or bring up related to this same topic? And John, thank you so much for being here and for being willing to share about, you gave us a whole variety of different things that we're using for clinical experiences. And I'm hoping that it has helped to clarify some things for our board members, and to kind of let them know where we're going and the direction that nursing education is taking.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite again, Dr. Mountain and Lane, for today. And again, any way that I can help, in any way that our team can help move, working with the task force, help facilitate that or whatever, we're here. And again, we're not just focused on community college programs. We're focused on the workforce, because at the end of the day, it's not our students, but it's the safety net of our patient population, our communities that we're looking for. So we want to make sure that the intent of using any kind of simulated clinical experience, telehealth services, is meeting the needs of the community and the safety of our community. So that's our ultimate goal. I mean, we're a collaborative spirit. So
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Any other questions in the chat room?
there was one. What are the limitations of telehealth for the LVN scope of practice?
I can try to kind of address that a little bit. I think this was, we were discussing telehealth in a generalized way in a meeting recently, and the idea is that Kaiser is such a model for this. They've been using telehealth for years to do nursing advice over the phone. They started it way back in the 80s. They were doing that. And they've used LVNs for a variety of ways, like follow-up phone calls and patient check-ins. Did you get your medications? If they had an ER visit, just calling to say, hey, were you able to fill your prescriptions? Are you scheduled for your home care nurse? Just some really basic things. And if you have clear guidelines and you have a decision tree, then that LVN can field some questions and then pass that on to another source, to the RN. And I think these are things that we're really have to figure out in nursing education, is how do we design these telehealth experiences so that the student feels supported and has oversight and has someone that they can move the questions that they can't answer to the person who can answer them. And those are all components of this that have to be looked at in nursing education. And so I even think the LVN scope of practice for telehealth, right now, it's a little bit unclear. There's a lot of gray in how we're managing telehealth and even what it means, because when we were talking about this, Loretta Mulvey was there from the BRN, and she immediately thought of telehealth as being only something where you can bill for those hours. And that's not necessarily true, because the hospitals are using telehealth for all kinds of nursing follow-up with patients that are discharged. That's a form of telehealth. And so we have a lot of work to do to establish what do these things mean, and what are the different legs that come down from an umbrella that's the term is telehealth. And so to discuss LVN scope of practice, I'm not sure we really have that defined yet.
Right. And I agree with you, Dr. Mountain, on that, because I think, part of when I was, doing some of the education stuff, I was actually in working with some of the students in our LVN emergency rooms, where we actually did the phone bank, and we were calling all the patients from the previous week admission to the ER to see if they follow up with anything that the physician ordered, or anything was, for them to go back and do or check, or, medications and things like that. And anything that was part of the educational part of it, or questions that a patient might have that the students can ask, then I was the RN on staff to provide that educational piece, so that they would flag me and I would take that call. So I think that as we define it, again, it goes back to, for me, it goes back to the clinical objective. Are we meeting the clinical objective in that intent for what that part of that course is, or that clinical component to that particular course? And that's what it comes down to, I think, personally.
I 100% agree. Are we meeting clinical objectives? And that's how we have to define, is what are these experiences and how are they going to align with clinical objectives, and where do they fit in the curriculum of these different programs, be it an LVN or an RN or an advanced practice nurse, so that they are working to the appropriate scope of their license.
Agreed.
Yeah. Other questions from the
Donna.
board? Go, Donna.
Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to weigh in here. So I think that the subject of telehealth is vitally important now we open that up, because what we see in practice, or I'll just say what I see in practice, is I went from being I'm using air quotes here, having an algorithm and an advice thing where I could field advice calls and take them, to being told that as an LVN, even with an algorithm, we couldn't do that. Then we went to where we would call and interact with patients to follow up on a previous office visit, and was told, oh, no, you can't do that either. And then to see now what's happening where they're using clerical or even medical assistants or clerical people to follow up with patients to gather that information and bring it back. And it does seem like the LVN is being left out of all of this. And as we look towards the future for what is everyone working to the full scope of their practice, it does seem like the LVN could be utilized at a much higher level than they currently are. So I'll just say that. And then I do think that as we talk about curriculum and all of that, and I appreciate all the presentations that went on today, but where I also see where LVN's work is in the clinics. And I don't know how much curriculum prepares LVNs coming out of school for clinical work. So I'll just add that in there as well as something that we might want to think about. So.
Yeah, Donna, this is John again, and I want to, I completely understand what you're saying, and that's one of the things when I said I recommended that maybe we need to do a job analysis that the current role of LVN is doing in the current work in the workforce today, and being able to take that. We call it a DACA, which is developing a curriculum, but essentially it's a job analysis and pulling LVNs from every level of practice and understanding what their current role is and what they're doing. And that might give you a better picture or provide a better outlook to the board about what is the current role that the LVNs are doing in any of these settings. And because we know that traditionally, we know for a while now that the LVNs are not working in the acute care facilities. However, I just heard last week that some of the Kaisers are going to be pulling LVNs back into the work pool. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure if they're going to be working in the acute setting or in the clinic, continue to work in the clinics or increasing their workforce. But I know in the Bay Area, the Kaisers are starting to say, we're looking at hiring LVNs because they can help do all the COVID testings and the nasal pharyngeal swabs. So they want to start bringing this workforce back into, and again, I can't say if it's the acute care setting or if it's going to be the outpatient setting, but there is a need to tap back into this workforce. Again, I think we need to look at, where is the majority of the workforce working? What is the current skills that they're doing? And then take a look at that, a hard look at that compared to what is currently in our standards of practice now. So.
John, I actually heard that same thing about LVNs, and I heard that they were going to be using them in urgent care. But they really said to themselves, what were we doing when we got rid of the LVNs out of urgent care? They have such a role there, and it's such a great use for them. Yeah. So, they'll just sneak back into the acute care. So you watch, it's happened before.
There was another question, well, it's more of a statement than a question. I'm concerned about the stress level that our future nurses have during the education when facing this pandemic. Is this being dealt with in the content of the curriculum and testing, and how can we simulate the learning on dealing with stress in practice? Do you want me to try to tackle that, Carol, or
we can share it? That's a pretty hot topic. I mean, it's all over the literature right now because of COVID and this idea that we haven't really encouraged our students or taught. These are things we have to turn around, and that the facilities have to step up and be part of this conversation as well.
Right. I agree. I think, we can do role-playing exercises with students to put them in the settings. The difficult thing is when we're doing, when we do role-play, and one of the things I want to say is, when I was running simulation, and one of the most difficult parts to get simulation in a nursing program was the mental health courses. And I had to convince the psych instructors on how to do this. And, I said, just give me a moment. Just give me an opportunity. I just want you to come observe. Let me pilot with one of your clinical groups and then see. I was able to do it, run it, and they were like a fan, and they were like the number one fan. I want to do this, with the rest of the clinical groups. Because I think it can be done in a certain way. The thing is, when you start talking about this, and we know this as educators, and we're talking about any particular thing, and we're talking about, sexual abuse or any kind of other, abuse in our courses, we have to be cognizant of, that might spark something in a student, or that might spark, post-traumatic stress in a student. So I think that in a way that we're doing things now, simulating those experiences could be simulating experiences with patients that might have that entity, and then they can talk about that, and some of that might come out in a sense. And I know that we need to do a better job of self-care. We try to do that on a regular basis, but and we've been putting resources on our website for you to have access to referrals for self-care for students as well. So any way that we can help bridge more of that'll be great.
And I just have to put this one last plug in, is that it starts with us. We're the role models. And if we're not taking care of ourselves and doing things to stay mentally healthy as nurse educators, our students see that. They see that, and they understand that we're just saying, hey, we're going to tell you what to do, but we're not going to do it. So we all have to do it, and we have to do it with intention. And I appreciate the resources that are on the HWI website too. They're very good. And I would encourage people to go there and encourage your students to go there.
Well, I thank you very much for inviting me today. And I hope that I can help facilitate anything that you wish us to be included with. And on behalf of Health Workforce Initiative, I want to thank everybody for all your work that you've done. I don't think you get the thanks that you need. Everybody on the call today, I just want to say thank you for all the work that you've done during this pandemic, because you had to rise up to an occasion that we were not prepared for. You prepared your students, you helped our patient population, and you're continuing to do that every day. And I just want to say, from the students and from the community, we thank you for your work that you're doing.
And thank you, John, for being here. We really appreciate it, sharing your thoughts and your experiences and helping to enlighten our board on trends that are happening right now in nursing education. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I want to open it up to the board. If you have any other comments or questions, things that you'd like to discuss related to what we've done today. Elaine, any words of wisdom?
I wouldn't call them words of wisdom, but thank you. Right. So the next steps, and I think our friends from NCSBN and John, of course, kind of alluded to, I think, what I think our natural next steps are. And we've been hearing conversations from our partners out in the field, the schools, the programs, the stakeholders, that this is really the beginning of a longer conversation. And just as BVNPT right now is looking very, very intensely at our practice acts, our codes and regs, we need to think through what nursing education and nursing regulations look like going forward. So I think to put that pressure on my board members, this is where we start, and I am so very, very pleased and gratified really to see so many people come for this conversation, and I know that the interest and the heartfelt commitment is out there to assist this board. And I also, not to forget, we also have our colleagues and allies in the healing arts programs, BRN, the Respiratory Care Board, and many, many others, the Department for Public Health, who train and regulate the certified nursing assistants. This is going to take all of us, really, I think, to think through what is going to be the picture of nursing going forward. And the one thing that we didn't really talk about much, because I think everybody knows it, and that's the fact that, quite honestly, we need more nurses. We need more nurses in a vast, different array, broad, diverse array of capacities. Doesn't necessarily mean vocational nurses or psych techs. We need to think through that workforce issue and that workforce development issue, where, you know, some people would tell you that this ideal picture is you start as a CNA and then you become an LVN and then you become an RN and then you become a advanced practice RN. And that doesn't work for everybody, and nor should it. But that ability to move forward in your education and training does need to be strengthened. It does need to be there. So as I said, you know, we have a number of big, meaty conversations to have in the coming months, and I'm really looking forward to it. Dr. Mountain?
Sorry, I muted myself. But I just said, Elaine, that was exactly what I would have said. I thought that was an excellent way to kind of sum up where we're at and what this whole education last 3 hours was about. And I wanted to open it up if there's any other comments or questions from the board members about the presentation today, or where they see things moving, or even their interest level.
This is Cheryl Turner. Thank you, everyone, for putting together this presentation. It is definitely something that is timely. We talked about a task force, but we've already started the conversation about this issue. And so, you know, I hope that we will continue to develop it, and we will hear from our stakeholders about their ideas and concepts, or even the students, so we can continue to develop rules and regulations that will stay up to date. Thank you.
Well said. Well said. If there's no other comments or questions, I don't see anything in the chat room. Moderator, do you see any?
This is the moderator. At this time, I don't see any comments from the audience at this time.
This is Alita Carpenter. I'm very impressed with all of the presentations, and especially the steps that are taken to develop critical thinking skills. Just fascinating. Thank you very much to all of the presenters. It's very, very gratifying, very enlightening.
Okay, if there's no other comments or questions, I think we can adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Yes?
Actually, let me make one closing comment.
Okay.
I did want to remind everybody that we will have the webcast of this presentation available on our website, and with the permission of NCSBN, the 2 PowerPoints from Dr. Benton and Dr. Dickinson. So look for those in the coming days.
Thank you, Elaine. That was excellent. So this meeting will adjourn, and see you guys in the morning.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the moderator. Recording has stopped. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.